Contemporary Black Voices right here at Black Video Network, where we take on the most pressing issues important to Black America. I'm your host, the writer Fred, for this week, along with Professor Dr. Sharon Michael Chadwell, New York Times bestselling author Caleb Alexander, and business and community leader and activist Chris Dawkins. One of those pressing issues that has been debated for over 2 centuries and never resolved is question of reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans who ultimately became Black Americans for over 250 years of free labor. One of the many definitions of reparations, the one that seems appropriate for our discussion, is monetary or other compensation payable to an individual or individuals for a historical wrong. An additional definition, just as applicable, reads, reparations are forms of compensation provided to those who have suffered wrongdoings or to their descendants. The term is especially used to refer to payments made or proposed to be made in the aftermath of war, slavery, or other forms of wide-scale systemic injustice. We can glean from these definitions the terms historical, wrong, slavery, and systemic injustice. They all fit what has happened to Black Americans for over 400 years of battling against the forces of evil in this country. The idea that Black Americans should be compensated for slavery is an old one. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass were proposing that all slaves should be free, then given money and property to help them start a new life after emancipation. In 1865, as the Civil War ended, the radical Republicans in Congress proposed a law to confiscate land from the plantation owners and give each former slave 40 acres of land and a mule. And we've all heard that, 40 acres and a mule. It was vetoed by the racist Southern President Andrew Johnson. At the end of the 19th century, a proposal that was popular called for a pension program to assist former slaves who were reaching old age. By the middle of the 20th century, civil rights organizations gathered support, claiming that all Black families were owed compensation for the racist legacy of slavery. The debate grew in the 1980s, and in 1989, a piece of legislation called the Conyers Bill demanded the creation of a congressional commission to investigate the legacies of slavery. The bill did not pass, but Congressman John Conyers, the late Congressman John Conyers, reintroduced it every session of Congress until he was forced to resign. In the year 2023, the San Francisco African American Reparations Advisory Committee has proposed a one-time payment of $5 million to each eligible Black resident of the city. No action has been taken by the city government on this recommendation. So it is quite apparent and appropriate that the issue of reparations is alive and well and is appropriate for contemporary Black voices to take on the subject. With us in the studio is Professor Mario Salas, a former city councilman and now professor of African American Studies at the University of Texas at San Antonio, to assist us in this worthwhile endeavor. Welcome, Professor Salas.
Well, thank you, Fred. I'm glad to be here. I hope I can contribute in some way.
Absolutely. I didn't mention that you also were a Black Panther at one time.
At one time, I was a SNCC, a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and also a member of the Black Panther Party.
Okay.
At one time.
Okay. All right. So, why reparations?
Well, I think any group, no matter what group it is, what ethnicity it is should be entitled to some form of compensation for whatever harm they've endured. And because of the nature of the harm, which is, been around across centuries, you could certainly make that argument for Native Americans, obviously. You make that argument in other countries as well, with other ethnic groups as well. You make that argument in Darfur with the genocide that went on there, or in Rwanda, for that matter. Mm-hmm. So I think you can make arguments for reparations of a whole lot of people. But one of the longest lasting legacies of evil, obviously, has been the American slave system. And so certainly, I think, at least in my opinion, that there ought to be some sort of reparations, try to make up. Apology is not enough.
Okay.
But a way to make up a lasting way to make up for the evil, the wrongs that were done in this country by the slave owners. So 250 years is a decent number. Yeah, I guess we're talking really realistically like 400, but
Absolutely.
but if we're only going to go by the
Slave-
foundation of the United States
Uh-huh.
of when it was founded, then maybe we're talking about from that point, because certainly the government of England owes us money. The government of Spain owes black people
Belgium.
money.
Well,
So
yeah.
so that's a different set of reparations,
Right.
because the Spanish introduced racism into Florida 100 years before 1619, and then
Okay.
1619 the Dutch, and then of course the English, of course.
Okay. You think that you could expand the period beyond slavery and include Jim Crow also?
Yeah, I would think so, because Jim Crow was devastating. It was a way to keep people, black people in particular, from exercising their rights, from being able to gather and keep wealth without being burned out or
Yeah.
killed, or whatever
Right.
the case may be, like in Tulsa and other places,
Right.
Elaine, Arkansas, and other places. But so yes, Jim Crow, in my opinion, should be also included in that formulation.
Okay.
What about now with the private prison system where the majority of those prisoners are black? And, you know, so they're removed
Well,
from
and
the
see, that's
home.
a good point. That's another thing that may come into play, because I mean, the Innocence Project has developed a long list of people that were falsely accused, incarcerated, spent years and years and years, and in most cases, many cases, never compensated for. They had to sue the prison system outside of, if they could, because in some states it's not allowed. You can't sue the prison system. So I would think that would apply, especially for those who've been wrongly convicted, or those convicted as a result of racial profiling, the result of, and that's almost everybody,
Because you
to
think
one
about-
degree or another.
Because you would think about what's going on in those prisons, they're basically working for pennies on the dollar, producing products for major corporations. And so that's that's slavery. That's just a huge
Yeah.
plantation.
Slavery by another name.
Yeah. Let me ask you this question. Okay, let's say you're the descendant of a slave mother and a plantation owner father. But over here is somebody who's a descendant of a slave mother and a slave father. So should that person be compensated more because both his parents had been slaves, but over here only one had been slaves?
Well, it kind of depends. It gets tricky, it gets complicated, because oftentimes a person of mixed ancestry, the result of a sexual relationship with a slave owner and, say, a black woman, which was usually the
Rape.
case, but rape,
Yes.
exactly, rape. So I don't know. I mean, you could put you can have arguments about what's worse, being hanged or being raped. You put them on the same, in my mind, you put them on the same category. A lot of guys think, being hanged is worse. I go, well, but rape also includes rape of men, which slave owners raped men
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
And so I kind of put both of those on the same level.
Okay.
So to me, they ought to both receive similar compensations.
Okay. The other, I'm a white guy in 2023, born in Michigan, where there was no slavery, going way back, and there's no history of us owning slaves. And I'm saying, why the heck should my money be used to pay for something that happened 100, 200 years ago? How do you respond to that, Mark?
Well, a lot of Michigan troops that fought for the Union, they were executed, they were shot without a trial, they were beaten, captured by Confederate forces. So there's a level of injustice even involved with free black men, some of whom were kidnapped, sent to the South. The famous movie 12 Years a Slave, the Fugitive Slave Act allowed that to happen. So I don't know anybody ever escaped that. And even in the most liberal northern city, there was still Jim Crow. So even though, maybe slavery was not allowed in some of those northern states, or was abolished early on, like in New Jersey and some of the other cities, there's still a level of hatred, still a level of injustice that took place that prevented black people from progressing.
Okay, then the other argument is they would argue, why should we bear the sins of our forefathers?
Well, you're not really bearing the sins of your forefathers, in my opinion. You're bearing the sins of a system that was set in place. You can individualize it, and that,
Okay.
to me, that's a way to take away the brunt of what this horror was all about.
Okay.
By saying, well, we may not be talking about your ancestors. And you know, if you're addressing a white person, maybe his ancestors didn't own slaves. That's not the point. The system that was in existence allowed slavery. So I don't think we're talking about ancestors any less. We're talking about ancestors less than we are talking about the system, or as you mentioned in the opening, the systemic relationship to the institution of slavery.
Right. Yeah. Questions?
Yeah.
Sure. You know, off camera we were talking about. You were joking with me about if I was given $40 million, that the next day I wouldn't have it. So the serious question for this debate.
How much does the IRS get, Chris?
A third. But as we talk about for today and reparations, so I have two questions. My first question is, how should we determine what reparations should be, especially given that Fred talked about the Jim Crow era? We're now going into a new era today of what we're talking about, and we are facing some of the kind of head raising of Jim Crow today, almost that happened some years ago, and we still haven't been compensated. The second question is are we as Black people really ready for reparations as it talks about a monetary value? And the reason why I ask that is because if you look at our athletes, and no matter how much money you may give them, they're going to be out of money the following year or whatever. So the question is that, are we really prepared right now for reparations?
Well, in addressing the first question, I like what writer Fred brought up about Jim Crow. When you look at compensation ideas, or the calculus of compensation, or packages, or whatever you want to call it, I think you have to look at what areas of Jim Crow law prevented people from succeeding or moving ahead. And so let's talk about that. What happened to Black folks in education because of Jim Crow? They didn't get any,
Right.
or they got a very inferior education, right? So that's one level. What else? They couldn't go to, my God, you couldn't go to a white hospital. So some people died in the parking lot of a hospital because they didn't know where the Black hospital was at. So let's break down Jim Crow and look at each one of those situations, and you can see, in my opinion, probably every Black person to one degree or another was a victim of racial discrimination during the Jim Crow era. And we're not even getting to the getting whipped part back during slavery, or being hanged during Jim Crow. More hangings in Jim Crow than there was during slavery, believe it or not. Well, because slaves cost money. Yeah. So the smallest amount of money you could purchase a slave for was about $600, maybe $400.
And so why would you hang that $600?
That's right, because they looked at it like property.
Yeah.
It's like, because they looked at it like property, it would be like killing your horse or your mule.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but after slavery is over, then there's no more monetary attachment to it. So that's why the hangings increased. So we're talking about all of those number of levels of things. Lack of medical care. Oh my God. So all right. So we're talking about that, and then that's why I don't like talking about monetary money. I think it has to be something more tangible than money. The 40 acres and a mule, I think, was more tangible than money at that time, because it was sharecroppers, Black sharecroppers. It was people who were able to get some land, or at least you could sell the mule or the 40 acres, which is considerable amount of money you could use. But that's more tangible than money, in my opinion. Then, now it's not. I mean, I don't have a farm. Chris, you got one?
Nope.
You need a mule at your backyard?
Nope.
No. So see, that doesn't mean anything now.
Okay. What kind of compensation would you?
Well, we can discuss or argue about the years. We can go with 250, we can go with 400, 450, whatever. Or let's take the British out and attack them separately. In the Spanish government, let's collect from them too, because I think we can collect from more than one source owes black folks in this country money or compensation. So, but let's talk about the American situation. If we were denied a decent education, decent medical care, then in my opinion, if we're only talking about the American one, or at least since the founding of America, leaving out the colonizer part, then we're talking about free medical care for the rest of our lives. And I would say for the next several generations as well. No more paying for any medicine, no more, I don't care what kind of operation, kidney, heart, whatever, free. So that way we're taking the very important, especially since black folks have a high incidence of all kinds of cancers. Colon cancer is probably the highest, or one of the highest. So we shouldn't have to pay for that. So that's a compensation that doesn't involve cash. It involves that. How about education? How about free books, free tuition, free everything for several generations? We can debate the generations part. I mean, you could probably develop some sort of algorithm that says after maybe 5, 6, 7 generations,
400 years.
yeah, things should be caught up. But we could argue about that. But for X amount of generations, whatever we can determine it should be. Free education, free medical care. That's at least 2 important areas where we don't have to worry about the money. And you're right, Chris. By the time a football player, basketball player retires, people don't realize this. A guy gets $28 million, over the life of a 10-year contract. When he's not playing anymore, he ain't getting that money. That money is gone. He's not getting that anymore. It's a lower percent. It's like retiring on a regular job. You're only going to get about 80, sometimes a whole lot less. Percent of what you were getting before you retired. So football players and the basketball players are going to get broke pretty quick if they get that, don't get that in their mind. It's going to dry up. So I don't like the money part, because certainly everybody can start arguing with you about, well, what about giving the dope heads and the crack dealers their share of the monetary? Well, we know what's going to happen with that money, don't we? Yeah, so we don't want. Money has to be taken off the table in my mind. I don't like the $5 million thing.
San Francisco thing.
Yeah, I don't like that. I don't. There's a real small town. Is it Michigan, Fred, or somewhere where they're doing reparations? It's a real small city. Might be Wisconsin, but I heard that on the news. It's the only city in the country that's actually doing
What's the
reparations.
justification? Is it for slavery or
For slavery.
for slavery? Okay.
When you were talking about preparedness, are we prepared for reparations? And so one of the things, and I'm going to say no, for the most part, we're not prepared in that, first of all, we already know you got to start thinking white at this point. What can I do to make, put up obstacles in the way of a certain group of people of getting something that, yes, they should get? So one of the things I think that everybody should do is do a genealogy search. And there are free sites like familysearch.org, Ancestry. We need to do a genealogy search. Think about who is the oldest member of your family that you can name, and start from that point and go front and back. The other thing is we have to be prepared for the trickery that will emerge if a check is given to us, because white folks will put, they can write a check today, but tomorrow they're already putting things in place to get that money back. And we saw it back in, I think it was in 1869, the Southern Homestead Act, where enslaved people were given 6 months to purchase land before even anybody white or from the North could make a purchase, and it was supposed to be at a lower rate. Well, a lot of them couldn't do it because they didn't have the stuff, they didn't have the things in place to purchase that land.
Or they weren't even told about it.
Or even told about it. And so, so eventually that act failed. So I think that now with the discussions even becoming more and more apparent, that we have to be prepared any way that we can to prove, yes, I had members of the family who were enslaved.
Okay, well, that's
Well,
it.
She's raised another good point about the ancestry
Can we
part.
pick that up in our second
Yeah,
session?
yeah,
Yeah.
because I want to deal with that.
Okay, we'll pick up right there. We have to take a break right now. We'll be right back with you with our discussion on reparations here at Black Video Network.